Welcome. The recording just started, so welcome everybody. My name is Ron Gillam. I'm the chair of the IRB, and I'm joined by Nicole Vouvalis, who is the executive director of the Human Research Protections program here at Utah State. The Institutional Review Board is an independent committee that's charged with the ethical review, revision, and approval of research involving human participants. So here at USU, the members of the IRB further review they further the university's research mission by reviewing proposed research involving human protections to ensure the protection of those research participants. We follow the principles of justice, beneficence, and respect for persons in all the USU research that involves human participants. Our job is to create a culture of ethical concern and prioritization of research participant interests and compliance with a variety of requirements and guidelines at international, federal, state, and local and university levels. Next screen. At USU, the Human Research Protection Program is under the auspices of the Vice President for Research. It involves the HRPP office, the Human Research Protections Office, that office manages the day-to-day aspects of implementing and overseeing the Human Research Protections Program. It also includes the IRB, where we review all proposed human research projects, and it involves the researchers themselves who are responsible for carrying out and overseeing their research with human protections in an appropriate manner. Next slide. So we review the research with respect to the standards of the Belmont Report and the Common Rule. The Belmont Report provides overarching ethical guidelines for the use of human participants in research, respect for persons, justice, and beneficence. Every review that we conduct at USU must ensure the presence of those principles. The Common Rule contains requirements for the composition of IRBs, the minimum criteria for approval of any human research protocol, standards for informed consent, and other important tenets of the IRB process. And it also has a subpart for distinct populations that are considered to be vulnerable. That is, pregnant women, prisoners, and children. And so we'll be talking about that quite a bit here. For its subpart G, you need to note that in most jurisdictions in the United States, students in schools are considered to be children even once they've turned 18. If they're being approached as students, most US jurisdictions have requirements in place that permit parents or guardians rather than students to make the final decision about their education and educational environment for as long as they're living at home and attending a K-12 school. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but right now we're going to just be moving on to really focus on um, the subpart D, the requirements that that the research is at no more than minimal risk, or that if it's greater than minimal risk, there must be a direct benefit to the children involved. There must be written parental permission, written child assent, and wards of the state require an in loco parentis permission process. So the key considerations for doing research in the school settings involve things like the recruitment process, parental informed consent process, child assent requirements, how FERPA impacts data collection activities, when teachers are used as researchers themselves, and the processes involved in teachers conducting research on their own or with their own students. So these are the topics that we will be discussing today. And I'm going to turn things over to Nicole Vouvalis, who will be presenting on each of these issues. Nicole.
Thanks so much, Ron. Thanks everyone for attending today, even though we have a partial solar eclipse outside. We did not think about that when we planned today's webinar, so we appreciate your time here with us today. Okay, jumping right into that list Ron just mentioned. Recruitment. Recruitment is considered the start of the informed consent process. It is the first time a prospective participant has an opportunity to gain information about a research study that will eventually lead to their decision to engage further or not. Informed consent, the primary application of the Belmont principle of respect for persons, is an aspect that all IRBs carefully consider when they're examining the ethical structure of a proposed research study. For this reason, it is important that researchers have a detailed, specific plan for how they're going to recruit families and schools into a research study. That includes the recruitment steps. So step by step, considering how a research participant, a prospective research participant family, will learn about your study. It includes the recruitment materials, information that you will share with them about your study. That could be a verbal script at a workshop that you're presenting at. It could be a letter home to parents. It could be a flyer. But those materials are as important for us to review as the informed consent documentation. Finally, it also includes support from your school partner or effective processes to make sure that you can get what you need for your school partners for the plan that you have articulated. When you're thinking about recruiting, FERPA can be a very useful recruitment tool. FERPA permits what is called directory information to be released by a school to anyone. As long as the school's policies account for the release of that directory information, it can be released. Most schools' policies do account for directory information to be utilized. It makes their lives easier if there's an inadvertent disclosure or something like that to say, oh, we said we might release this up front. As a result, that can be an extremely useful tool for informing families about your study. Directory information is that information which a school has said in their annual notice of privacy practices they will release without that family's permission. So you'll want to check directly with the school before they release any information, but here are some things it can include: a student's name, an address, a telephone listing, an email address, date of birth, major field of study, their grade level, their enrollment status, general dates of attendance, and participation in officially recognized activities. We'll talk a little bit more about directory information later on, but I just want to give an overview of how it can play into your recruitment process, because as you can see, Email addresses, being directory information, gives you pretty easy access to most families who would need to be approached for research participation in a school setting. So knowing what the school can and can't release and their policies around that can be a really helpful tool for you as a researcher as you plan your recruitment steps, your recruitment materials, and whether you'll have the support of your school partner. Some things to keep in mind. An educational record that is protected by FERPA is an identifiable education record. That means a record that is maintained by the educational institution that identifies the student with reasonable certainty. Generally speaking, those records cannot be disclosed to a researcher, including the information contained within them, without parental consent occurring first. What does this mean for recruitment? Especially in the special education context for work that we see here at Utah State, researchers often need to know whether a student has an IEP or whether they're receiving a particular service, something like that, before they can know who might be eligible to even participate in research. One effective way around this is to develop a two-step recruitment process. The first step asks all parents in your targeted setting or guardians whether you can access and review educational records so that you can send information only to families for whom that may be relevant. And so you can send out a little bit of information about your study in what's called a FERPA authorization document, which we have a link to in our resources slide at the end. And you can ask, can we look at these records and see if you are eligible? And if so, we'd like to send you some more information about your or your students' potential participation in our research study. So it allows you to see whether targeted characteristics are present and then have that second step where you say, okay, you're eligible because, and here's what this means, and here's why we think you might want to participate. Another way to approach that, though, is having parents or guardians self-disclose into those spaces. So if you don't need access to records before you can even recruit, for example, you could say, we are looking for parents whose children have X, Y, and Z characteristics. Sign and return this form if your child has X, Y, and Z characteristics and you're interested in their participation. And that allows you, that the signing of that form then allows you to go back and verify whether those characteristics are actually present. And so that's one way to get around the two-step, but it does require you to sort of send broad strokes notes and rely on parents to sort of self-identify into a study rather than you as a researcher identifying families that may be eligible for your work. Some other things to keep in mind: work in K-12 schools in the state of Utah requires district approval. So if you're using any school-owned space, any resources that are owned by a school district or public charter, you must have a district level or governing board level approval before the USU IRB will grant its final approval. Public charter schools, that comes from the governing board or its appointed representative. And at districts, every district has a different process or person that they authorize to do those approvals. And so you'll want to work closely with your identified school districts to make sure you're working with the correct entity or person. We can and we do give preliminary approvals. If the school district or the LEA or the governing board wants assurances that we've provided approval first, we'd be happy to provide you a preliminary approval to then provide back to that district. You just have to ask us. And then finally, note that there's no requirement on the USU IRB side of things that researchers seek district approval for schools outside the state of Utah. However, I do want to take a moment here and just note that you do need to be aware of the policies and the procedures where you are hoping to complete your work. Many school districts and LEAs require both district level approvals and school-based approvals. Just because the USU IRB does not require them does not mean that they are not required for you to carry out that work. We've seen a lot of projects negatively impacted because the school or the school district did not provide its approval for its resources because the USU IRB didn't say it was required for approval. And so some schools and school districts do the equivalent of, sending out a cease and desist to researchers who are working in those spaces. So it's very important for you to be cognizant of the policies and procedures for research that are in place at the location where you're hoping to do your work, not just the USU IRB requirements for gaining approval. One more thing I'd like researchers to be aware of. Many school districts, especially larger ones, both within the state of Utah and in other states, require that you pay a deposit for their approval process, which you generally do receive back when you return to them the results of the research. In such cases, it's also important, well, A, it's important that you plan for that. But B, it's important that you note in your informed consent documentation and in your process that you do intend to share those findings or that data, whichever is true for your particular study and the parameters of your approval, so that parents and teachers have a good sense of how that data will be utilized. Moving on to parental informed consent processes. Here I've created just a quick chart of parental informed consent processes since they can get complicated in kind of a hurry. These cover some of our more common scenarios for seeking parental consent out of school subjects. And I should note that they assume a minimal risk project. These do not apply in cases where projects are any greater than minimal risk. The processes do change to generally require an affirmative parental signature and an affirmative agreement from a child that is documented whenever you're doing greater than minimal risk work with this population. But for example, if researchers will send consent documents home in a child's backpack for parents to sign and return, and children will give written assent themselves, that would not require a waiver or an alteration because every person who's participating is participating with two signed documents, a parental consent form and a child assent form. But a limitation there is that it's generally not effective where the research team requires the entire class's participation. And so that's a limitation to be aware of. Whereas if you are a research team that has partnered with a school to implement a research project, we'll talk more about that in a moment, parents will receive a consent form directly from the research team. The research team is using directory information, so the very same contact information that schools use to get important information in front of parents. So you're putting it in front of them and they have an ability to opt out. You know that they will see it. So you know that an opt-out means that they truly mean to opt out and not just that they didn't see the thing. You would request a waiver of documentation of informed consent. Whereas if you're working in an entire school classroom and all that's happening is some consent forms are getting put into a child's backpack on the way home, that would require a waiver of all requirements for informed consent because you're not certain in such cases that parents have actually laid eyes on, reviewed an informed consent document, and then just decided that it was fine. And so in order for that process to proceed, you would require a waiver of all requirements for informed consent. These slides will also be emailed out to all of our registrants, and so you don't have to remember or take notes on any of this. We'll go ahead and send it to you. A limitation there to note is that FERPA demands an affirmative agreement for the use of identifiable education records that are not directory information in some cases. And so you'll want to make sure that that partnership involves one of the FERPA exceptions that we will talk about in just a few minutes. This is just a general guide to some of the more common approaches to informed consent and assent that we see. On the last slide, our resources slide, we also have an opportunity for you to request a consultation with a member of our office so that you can talk through any specific informed consent processes you might be considering in any of your research projects that maybe aren't covered by this chart. Parental informed consent processes. Many research studies will be conducted in English in our schools, and there's a perfectly good reason for that. The study team only speaks English, the curriculum is only available in English. There are many good reasons to limit your actual target population to English speakers. However, researchers must plan for a parent's ability to understand the recruitment and informed consent materials. And that's at a minimum. Sometimes you have to prepare for parents to be able to understand the entirety of the study documentation. We'll talk in a moment about those activities which require specific parental consent and an opportunity to review all of the study materials as well. But generally speaking, recruitment and informed consent materials for your K-12 student populations must have an informed consent and recruitment process that goes home to parents or guardians in a way that is easily understandable to those parents and guardians. Here, we have a chart that is, that references census data leading up to 2021 of Utahns who speak a language other than English in the home. And that's not to say that they don't have the ability to understand English in the home, but the article where I pulled this did say that only about half of the families who speak a language other than English in the home are also English proficient. So here are some considerations for making sure that your informed consent is presented to parents in a way that is easily understood by them. Generally speaking, Spanish translations are a minimum requirement for US UIRB approval. There are exceptions to that. If you, for example, know that the classroom within which you're working have parents who are all English proficient, just get some documentation from the teacher or from the school indicating that, yes, this is a classroom where we only send English materials home, and you will not need to provide translated recruitment or informed consent materials. However, we do know that in the state of Utah, there are plenty of families who do not speak English in the home, and particularly parents who have often immigrated to the United States, whose children are perfectly proficient in English and thus perfectly eligible for research participation, but the parents do require the information about the study to be presented to them in another language. So you'll want to work with your school partners to identify those language-based needs in the spaces where you'll be working. If the research team does not have the resources to complete translations, I've been made aware that the Office of Equity is developing some policies and procedures for working with limited English proficiency populations, and they plan to provide resources to folks who require assistance in communicating with people with limited English proficiency. So that's a resource that may be coming down the pipeline. And I would encourage folks to keep an eye on that policy and the associated procedures to see how they might be able to put those to work for their research projects. Generally speaking, not having the funds to complete translations is not an ethical justification for excluding otherwise eligible students from your study. So this is a thing that folks need to plan for. Again, identifying the classrooms and spaces where you will be working and seeing what language needs exist in those spaces is the very best way to develop a plan for ensuring that you're able to meet the requirements of getting recruitment and informed consent information home to parents in a way that is easily understood by those parents for the participation of their English-speaking students. So here's a state-level intricacy regarding parental informed consent. There are some types of work in schools where researchers cannot avoid affirmative, documented parental informed consent. If the data that will be collected or even reviewed include anything on this sub-bulleted list, the research team must collect affirmative parental consent. This applies regardless of whether the information sought will be done in an identifiable or an anonymous fashion from the child. A child may not sit for a survey, even anonymously, if their parents have not given affirmative parental consent and that survey is about any of these topics. It is quite broad. There is a similar law that is at the federal level called the PPRA, and it does have some of these exclusions for requiring affirmative parental consent, but Utah's state law is considerably broader. So if you look at that last sub-bulleted point there, income is something I think that we're all fairly accustomed to asking on a demographic survey. What socioeconomic status do you identify with? What class would you say you are? How much money do you make? These are all questions we review every single day in our office. It's a very common question. If you are asking it of a child in a K-12 Utah space that is public, so that includes public charters, then there must be affirmative parental consent before that child can sit for that survey. Some of the other topics include critical appraisals of individuals with whom the student or family member would have a close family relationship, religious affiliations or beliefs, mental or psychological problems, which is quite a broad term, political affiliations or political philosophies, and any psychological or psychiatric examination, test, or treatment. So if you're planning to do work in a K-12 setting in this space, you must have a pretty robust informed consent process, which I will go over next. If you're doing work that is covered by that state law, in order for the informed consent to be legally valid, the following conditions must be present. Generally speaking, they boil down to parents have an opportunity to review any instruments, and that they are given a 2-week waiting period between learning about the study and giving their informed consent. The idea here is that that 2-week waiting period allows them to review the instrument, and it allows them to ask questions about any of the sub-bulleted points listed on this slide. So the means by which the records or information will be reviewed, the purposes for which the records or information are needed, which really impacts the researcher's ability to use deception, misinformation, or incomplete information in their informed consent process. Because parents are allowed to know the purposes for which you are asking children questions, you cannot use a misinformation or an incomplete information approach when you're talking about any of these topics. And then that last sub-bulleted point there, the method by which a parent of a student can grant permission to access or examine any personally identifiable information. That is one where it's a limitation on your ability to keep things confidential. So this boils down to essentially a 2-week waiting period where parents have the ability to get questions answered about what it is their child is going to be participating in. And again, the exact survey must be available both at the school as well as online for your informed consent process to be legally effective under the topics we just discussed on the last slide. Parental informed consent processes in this specific context also require that the data use be quite limited. So you generally cannot retain data for any other research purpose once you've gathered it under this informed consent process. And the Utah Code also contains what is called in sort of broad privacy legislation, the right to be forgotten. Just like HIPAA, it allows parents to withdraw authorizations to ask their child the types of questions you're interested in asking, or even to review information that might already exist about them in the school's records. And so that makes things kind of tricky because a lot of folks want to collect data anonymously in this setting, but you have to find a way that a parent can withdraw an authorization for you to complete this process. Now, you can make clear in your informed consent process, for example, that you'll only have an identifying code for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, there's no way to know whose is whose. And so they have to withdraw by that time point or something like that. And a very common way to engage this is to have students create a unique code that's available to them, made up of factors that are about them, but which do not themselves identify. And so I gave an example in the bots and fraudulent responses training that I gave 2 weeks ago about how one might do this, right? So, what are the first 2 numbers of my street address? What are the last 2 letters of my favorite color? And then what are, the last 2 letters of my mother's maiden name, something like that. And that allows me to create a code that only I would know and that I can contact you to withdraw my data about, but you wouldn't know who I was other than that. And so we would encourage the use of codes like that if you are planning to collect data of this variety in a Utah K-12 setting. One last thing to note is that none of the data that you collect under these circumstances can be entered into the Student Achievement Backpack, which is Utah's term for an electronic learner profile that's maintained by the academic institutions who are also public institutions in the state of Utah. So critically, can't feed any of this data into student educational records, and understand that this data is really one-time use data for the purpose that you articulated during the informed consent process, after which it is done and must be destroyed. Moving on to child assent requirements. Okay, so I want to stop because moving on to children, most of these spaces are going to require English proficiency, but can you use Google Translation for parental information? In some cases, yes. So we do have a translation standard operating procedure that identifies several different ways that you can complete a translation process that will be accepted. If you use Google Translate, we will have a reviewer review it for accuracy as against your English materials. And so that does sometimes take a little bit more time. Spanish is a very easy language for us to find a reviewer who can review and ensure accuracy. But if you are working in Mandarin, for example, that's going to take us a little bit more time. And so you'll just want to build a little more time into your planning process to allow us to sort of back translate that information and make sure that it is as accurately captured as the English version. I will say Google Translate has come a long way. It used to be the case that the Spanish version was pretty awful when I first started here. And now there are relatively few mistakes that Google Translate is making in terms of ensuring the Spanish translation of materials. I would not vouch for Google Translate for other languages. And so, again, very important for you to work with your school partners and know the audience that you're targeting for participation and understand what their language requirements are before you get going. The very best option, of course, is a certified translation. And we do have in Lingua Utah is a partner in translations. They offer a 10% discount to all Utah State University researchers who are using their service to translate research materials. And we've also worked with them extensively. And so they are able to effectively translate weird terms like institutional review board, because nobody knows what an institutional review board does outside of our very specific context. And so they've worked closely with us to make sure that even complex research specific terms like that are being effectively translated and are presented in meaningful ways to the participant population that you're working with. So the answer is yes, you can use Google Translate. However, we will make sure that it communicates all of the language and information that would be communicated in the English version. And in that case, if our reviewer says it's not good enough, they're not going to fix it for you. They're just going to let you know that it does not do as good a job as communicating in that language as it does in English. And so it would be your responsibility as a member of a research team seeking to do work with that population to make sure that you're using a resource that can share the information in a language that is easily understood to your target participant and their families who give informed consent. It's a great question. And while Ron is talking a little bit later, I'll try to find a link to that SOP to pop in for you all as well. But it is on our website. Moving on to child assent requirements. The USU IRB joins almost every other IRB in the United States in saying that a child should be asked to give their assent, which should be documented, if they are aged 7 or older. So the IRB is charged with ensuring that assent of children is solicited when, in the IRB's judgment, the children are capable of providing assent. And if you Google IRB age of assent, you'll find that pretty much every IRB in the country sets that age at either 6 or 7. We set it at 7. We would certainly welcome a research team's effort to obtain assent from a child younger than 7. We're just letting you know as researchers that you should have a plan for documenting child assent if the child is age 7 or older. And in many cases where the children are, say, between the age of like 7 and 13, it's appropriate to have a witness document the assent rather than the child themselves. Like, they don't have to sit down and review a form. So again, looking for that magical cutoff of age 7, and then making sure that you're designing an assent process that is appropriate for the children that you're working with. Here are some best practices. Use spatial separations in your document and use shapes or bubbles to set off important information or to make things very clear that you're talking about different topics as you're working through your assent documentation. Include pictures of procedures and pictures of the equipment that you'll use if you're using any specialized equipment in your research involving children. Model the research procedures either in person or in a video for the children who are giving their assent. It's a great suggestion for informed parental permission as well, but especially for children who might not know, for example, what an FNIRS is. Showing them a picture and modeling how it works is a nice way to make sure that they understand what's being asked of them. Ask comprehension questions to ensure that the children understand what it is you've explained to them or what it is you've had them read about your consent process. Again, great practice with adults as well, but it's an especially valuable practice for ensuring that children who are considered a vulnerable population have full understanding of what's being asked of them. Run your assent document through readability software if you're comfortable doing that, and ensure that it's age appropriate. And of course, the older your child age population gets, the more appropriate it is to develop something that is more closely aligned to our adult informed consent templates and our adult informed consent processes. But when you're working with children, there's free and easily available readability software that ensures that they are indeed age appropriate. And I do mean age appropriate and not just grade level appropriate. Here's a headline from an article in the Salt Lake Tribune earlier this year that shows that after analyzing, I think it was Dibble scores, only 48% of Utah third graders are reading at the third grade level. And so grade level and age appropriate are not necessarily the same thing when you are looking at an assent process that is easy for the children to understand and which is responsive to the space where they are in terms of comprehending what's being put in front of them. So again, if you're using readability software, grade level, age level, not necessarily the same thing. It's important to know your audience and tailor your informed consent, parental permission, assent processes to them. And so just a recap of the informed consent process for working with children in this setting. When you are working or collecting data about children in a school setting, your informed consent process generally will consist of parental permission plus assent from the child if they are over age 7 and otherwise have the ability to give assent, plus researcher-maintained documentation that process occurred if the documentation requirement has not been waived by the IRB. For a fully effective, fully executed informed consent process, these are the 3 things that must be present for you to say you have informed consent. Let's move on now to talk a little bit about FERPA. FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, protects the privacy of and provides family with an opportunity to review educational records maintained by the child's school that are about that child. It also gives parents an ability to request amendment to those educational records, less relevant in the research context, just a FERPA overview. FERPA records include things like behavioral or disciplinary records, student test scores, standardized test scores that reside with the school for one reason or another, records created during visits with a school psychologist or a guidance counselor, and any other record the institution maintains about a child and which directly or indirectly identifies that child. So FERPA is a very broad records privacy law, and it protects those education records which are identifiable. And again, identifiable means that it directly identifies or can identify with reasonable certainty the child that the record is about. FERPA also allows, but does not require, schools to release directory information. So we talked a little bit earlier about some examples of directory information and ways you might utilize that to recruit parents and families to your study or to use it in your informed consent process as well. FERPA permits parents to opt out of any sharing whatsoever of their child's information. And this is why it's critical for you to work directly with your school partners as an entity and not just with one person who maybe has access to information about that school. Everyone here, I'm sure, took the FERPA training for USU, right? And so you received those training modules on the hold on student information, right? So certain students, actually anybody, but for certain reasons, can go to request from the institution that the institution not share any information about that student at their institution. So if I'm a student at USU, I can ask USU not even to confirm my dates of attendance. And USU must abide by that request. And that's why it's critical that you're working with the school's infrastructure and not just with one particular teacher. It is not always the case that like one teacher in one classroom has access to records about which families have requested those holds or those stops. And if the school violates that by giving out directory information for someone they shouldn't, that can land your school partners in really hot water. And of course, our primary concern here is that participants' information is being protected in ways that they expect. But we also don't want you getting your school partners in trouble. That is not a good look for the USC research community. And so it's important, again, that you are working with the infrastructure that is set up for this kind of sharing when you're accessing things like directory information. FERPA also requires specific affirmative parental consent to share identifiable education records that are not directory information. So if it's not directory information, the general rule is that researchers may not access it unless the parent has given their explicit permission for it to be accessed. So those are some highlights of FERPA, and of course you can see how that might impact some data collection activities. So what does it mean for your research? There are two sort of high-level rules or pieces of advice to keep in mind. First, letters of information or other passive consent processes will almost never be sufficient in terms of using any records maintained by the school about that student. The student's parents or guardians will need to affirmatively give their permission for researchers to access that information, even if you already have access to it because you're an employee at the school. We'll talk about those dual relationships in just a moment. The next thing to keep in mind is that even though our informed consent templates are legally sufficient to meet the requirements for FERPA, you need to work with your stakeholders and your school partners. Some schools and districts have their own forms and their own processes that they want to use for providing access to FERPA protected records. Individual teachers have a lot to do every single day that they are in that space, and they may not have at the forefront of their brains the very specific stepwise requirements to give and share and gain access to identifiable education records at that school. And so again, working with your district partners, working with your school partners to make sure that you are meeting the requirements they have in place is a huge piece. Just because our consent forms meet the requirements of FERPA does not mean that a school has to accept that consent form to release identifiable education records. So begin communicating with administrators on both sides, the IRB as well as your school site, so that you aren't surprised by late arriving forms and late arriving requirements, because every school district, just like every IRB, is a little bit different. Okay, FERPA has some exceptions to the requirement that parents must give their affirmative consent before those records can be accessed. We've already talked about directory information. Directory information is that information which is identified by the school district in their notice of privacy practices annually, that is information that can and will sometimes be given out without a parent's permission. It does have to be posted in their notice of privacy practices. So you as a researcher should very easily be able to find the information that you can gain access to via directory information. As a reminder, directory information allows a school to release that information about a student or a family. It does not require them to. And so even if that information is included in their notice of privacy practices as directory information, it does not mean that the school must give it to you if you're seeking it as directory information. If you're seeking it at the behest of a parent with their permission, generally speaking, the school must make that available to you. As a reminder, the types of information that fall under directory information: student's name, address, an email address for parents, a telephone listing if it exists, student photograph, date of birth, major field of study, grade level, enrollment status, dates of attendance, participation in officially recognized activities and sports, weight and height of members of athletic teams, degrees, honors, and awards received, and the most recent educational agency or institution attended. Those are the items which fall into directory information and which a school may release without affirmative parental consent. However, it's not always the case that a researcher requires identifiable information in order to complete their research. So records that have been fully de-identified by the school's registrar or their academic records office also do not require affirmative parental consent before they can be accessed. Again, critically important here that you're working with the registrar or somebody from the academic records office and not just a teacher who's working in that classroom, because it is often the case that teachers do not have information that the school has about children whose information can and cannot be released. So really important to make those connections between the person that you're actually going to be functionally working with and their academic records office to ensure that you're complying with FERPA in the scope of your research activities. Research records that are released for the student's legitimate educational interest is another space where, okay, does directory information include information on free or reduced lunch? It does not. In fact, free and reduced lunch status is one that is federally protected. So just like identifiable education records, there's a separate law on the books which states that free and reduced lunch status cannot be released without affirmative parental consent for the release of that information. That does not preclude you as a researcher for saying, I'm seeking families whose child receives free and reduced lunch. Please respond if you are interested in learning more about our study, but it does mean that you cannot just gain that information from the school without affirmative parental permission. That's a great question. I almost included it in the slides, but I thought it was too specific. So I am glad somebody asked. FERPA allows for the release of identifiable education records if the record is released for the student's legitimate educational interest. Schools have the ability to say what they consider a legitimate educational interest. Generally speaking, the Department of Education frowns on research being a student legitimate educational interest. They have guidance, and I've attended workshops where folks from the Office for Civil Rights and the Department of Education have said that is not their understanding of the use of that provision. But that doesn't mean there isn't space where there's overlap. So a research only release may not comport with FERPA's requirement for legitimate educational interest. However, where you're partnering with the school because they've approached you, they're interested in something that you're expert in, there can be spaces where the legitimate educational interest overlaps. For the purposes of IRB review processes, we would require some documentation from the school that they are identifying that release as such. It's a very rarely used piece of a FERPA exception in a research context, but that's not to say that we would not approve it. And finally, here are the more commonly used exceptions. FERPA permits an educational institution to release identifiable education records if the researcher has partnered with the educational entity in order to do one of the three things listed in A, B, or C. It does require, again, a formal partnership between the researcher and the educational institution. Typically at USU, when that's occurred, it's taken the form of an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding between USU on behalf of that researcher and the school district or the school itself. Because it involves student records, it must also have a data sharing agreement component. So you can have a separate data sharing agreement, or you can have data handling and data sharing contemplated within the Memorandum of Understanding. But if you want to seek identifiable education records under one of FERPA's exceptions for conducting studies for or on behalf of an educational institution in order to develop, validate, or administer predictive tests, administer student aid programs, or improve instruction, you can do that with a Memorandum of Understanding between yourself as a researcher and USU and the school district. There isn't something to be aware of here, which is that the study team may never release identifying information about the children, and the research team must destroy or return the data at the first opportunity to do so. And so if this is a space where you want to retain data long-term, working under one of these exceptions is not going to be the place for you to do that, because it does require, just like the specialized Utah context that we talked about just a little bit ago, that you delete all of the information, not just the identifiers, but all of the information as soon as it's practicable to do so. Now, that could be an extended period of time, of course. More and more journals are, requiring long-term maintenance of data. It cannot be made available, so you can't put it into an open repository, but that doesn't mean that you can't retain it for a certain amount of time specified by a journal or by a sponsor in this context. Okay, moving on to one of our other topics, whether teachers are participants or researchers. This can get pretty tricky in an educational setting. When research is completed in a school setting, it's not always the easiest thing to discern whether a teacher is a research participant, a researcher, or, as is often the case, both. So here are the definitions for human subject, and here are the definitions for the investigator, both of which come directly from the United States Office for Human Research Protections. The TLDR version is that if you have a teacher completing any of these tasks, you are going to have an investigator, even if you also have a participant. I know that text got a little bit small. So obtaining information about living individuals by interacting or intervening with them for research purposes, obtaining identifiable private information about living individuals for research purposes, obtaining the voluntary informed consent of individuals to be subjects in research, or studying, interpreting, analyzing identifiable private information or data for research purposes. So if they're doing any of those things, they are probably an investigator. And so what does that mean for you? Again, here are some examples of researcher tasks, but if they are indeed researchers, they must be trained in human subjects research ethics, and they must give the USU IRB oversight of their activities as a researcher. So how do we do that? Let's talk first about the agreement, ceding to the IRB oversight of their activities as a researcher. We make a short, it's a 1.5-page agreement available for external researchers to use. That agreement outlines the basic responsibilities of a researcher working with human research participants. In the case of a teacher, it would require sign-off from a principal so that the principal understands that in that specific setting, the oversight of that person's activities are shared between them and between the USU IRB. And so that allows their supervisor to understand that in that space and time, they are fulfilling two roles, one of which is subject to oversight from an outside entity, which is pretty uncommon in a school context. The agreement, by the way, there's a little screenshot of the first page, but it is linked directly from protocols in Kowali. So if you say you're using a non-USU researcher in your protocol in Kowali, it gives you a list of agreements to choose from. And you would be using the external researcher agreement for your teacher researcher participants. And so you don't have to crawl around on our website to try to find it. It's just linked right there whenever you say that you need it. And again, it's a 1.5-page agreement. It's quite short. It just briefly goes over the requirements for conducting human subjects research. And then they must receive some research ethics training. You are welcome to use our city training for that. Any person who is outside of USU can use the USU city training license to become trained in human subjects research ethics. You just have to use the not single sign-on. It's just like the regular login option in order to create an account and do that. However, there are alternatives to city training, and we'd like to make you aware of those alternatives. We very much encourage research teams to design trainings that are geared only toward the role that your teacher partner will play in fulfilling your research project. Well, I say only, but there are some background pieces of information that are required. For example, you're going to have to do training on the Belmont principles, what the common rule is, what human subjects research is, why oversight is necessary. Those are the sort of baseline things, along with some information about privacy and confidentiality and risks and benefits. But then, if your teacher is not carrying out your informed consent process, it is not critical that they receive training on the informed consent process. If they are not going to be in a position to report an unanticipated adverse event, it is not important that they receive training on unanticipated adverse events. So we really encourage research teams to design trainings that are geared only toward the roles that the teacher partners will fulfill on top of the sort of basic requirements for human research ethics trainings. Researchers can design those trainings specifically for their non-USU researcher teacher partners. And then they can submit that to us for approval. We make sure that those things comport with the scope of work that you provided to us in the protocol, and we can approve that training for delivery, and then you certify that they have completed the training, and that makes them able to serve as an investigator on the protocol. It is, of course, more work for you, but we do think it's a kindness that you can implement for especially your teacher partners. I know fewer people that have more to do with less pay than teachers. So the extent to which you can make that specific to what it is they need to know, we think the better off they are. We also have other training alternatives. The Office for Human Research Protections makes a training available for anyone who's interested in engaging in human subjects research. It's quite similar in time to our city training, but it goes over sort of the broader stuff in more detail. So less time on things like unanticipated risks and reporting to IRBs, things like that. And so that is a free training that is available, produces a certificate at the end, and then they can provide that certificate to you. You provide it to us in your protocol, and they'll be all set. We also have USU faculty have developed a training called Integrity and Partnership Advancement that was designed specifically for training researchers on work completed in Indigenous communities. And so you can utilize those trainings. All that to say, we are flexible on how the training content is delivered and where it comes from, but it must be pre-approved and it must accompany an external researcher agreement if you are asking your teachers to serve as investigators on your research project. That is a great segue into teachers working with their own students as subjects. USU has a robust culture of practitioner researchers. That can make things complex, but it does not make them inherently bad. It simply requires additional safeguards. Lots of people wear 2 or more hats in their daily lives. And the key thing to remember when conducting human subjects research especially with vulnerable participants like children, is not to wear your multiple hats at once. For television fans, the best advice I can give you for working with your own students is to plan your study as though you're a character in the television show Severance. For those of you who haven't seen it, the premise of Severance is that people willingly agree to have no recollection of their in or out of work lives, depending on which space they're in. So when they're in work, they're called their innies. They have no idea about anything having to do with their personal lives. And when they're out of work, they're outies. They don't remember anything about their day-to-day work situation. And so I do not recommend such a drastic approach. If you've seen that show, you'll note that there are a lot of problems with taking such an all or nothing approach to those 2 spaces. But it's a helpful way to sort of think about the structure you should be designing in order to work with your own students and have them treated as your own subjects. In many, though certainly not all, cases, when you're designing and constructing a research project involving your own students, you'll want to plan it as if you are an outsider. Records and spaces that you have access to by virtue of your daily role in that classroom are distinct from your access as a researcher. And so I mentioned earlier that the Department of Education frowns on considering research a legitimate educational interest of a student. And it's because those 2 purposes are distinct from each other. And so when you're planning your research project, think about it as somebody else who's coming to you and asking what it would take to gain access to those records and those spaces, rather than it being you who has access to those records and spaces. Those records and spaces are for teachers. Your researcher hat is your outie when you're a teacher innie. Teachers must also recognize that they're the primary caregivers for children in their classrooms for the majority of their school day. Parents and guardians are relying on teachers to keep their children safe and cared for. And as a result, teachers have to understand that when they ask parents of children in their classrooms to engage a thing, there is a piece of influence there. We know it's never intended, and we know that teachers would wipe it away in a moment if they could. But parents will feel some pressure to agree to participate. Children will certainly feel pressure. Teachers are an authority figure in their lives. And so if a teacher is asking them to do a thing, they will feel some pressure to say yes to that authority figure. And so before you're using your own students, really strongly consider whether conducting research in your own class comports with the Belmont principle of justice. Are these children being targeted because it's easy or convenient? Or is it because their unique scenario and your unique training, they really are the best situated to help educators learn something about the world of education? If it's a mix, researchers should consider how to work to dismantle those structures of undue influence that just simply are present when you're working with vulnerable populations in a figure of authority. We have a guidance document that we make available, which contains some of these suggestions. Where you can, use existing data. Existing data minimizes the ask. And so it makes it less of a big deal to say no or to really consider alternatives to participation. In some cases, where you can work directly with a central office to obtain that data, it eliminates the ask altogether. So it gets rid of all of the pressure that might exist in that relationship otherwise. Involve a third party in your research who doesn't have a relationship to the families or the students in your class. This person can make the asks and commit to safeguarding responses until time has passed such that the children are no longer in that teacher's daily care. They can answer questions about the research without parents feeling also like the parents are sort of poking at a project, right? So it allows them to get unbiased and uninfluenced information about the research project. If there's a third party that they can really contact and talk to and bounce ideas off of before agreeing to participate. See if your school is interested in the benefits of your research project. We talked just a moment ago about some FERPA exceptions and where the school district believes that you are helping them to, for example, improve instruction. You can also minimize the ask, right? Where you have that partnership in place and you're informing parents of the partnership, you're really not asking as much of those families in your space. And so you can say that the school has partnered with you because it believes the students will benefit from the change that you're looking to investigate. And again, just minimizes some of those pieces of influence. And then finally, minimize the overlap between core content and research procedures. Just as a general rule, the IRB does not love to see core content modules and time spent on research that doesn't have any direct benefit tied to those core requirements in schools. And so if research procedures are occurring during free periods or optional tracks or before or after school, it again works to minimize the undue influence and it makes parents less concerned about what their child might be missing out on. So here are some resources. I did not spend much time talking about this, but I do want to note USU Policy 534 on the protection of minors. USU has a policy on the protection of minors, and within the next year, the carve out for IRB approved research is going to go away. So it will soon be the case that all researchers must comport with USU Policy 534. It includes things like making sure that people who are interacting with children are background checked, being sure that you're not one-on-one with a child, either in your communications or in your in-person interactions with that child, unless the procedures specifically warrant the need for a one-on-one process. Pieces like that are sort of generally what schools would implement to have you in those spaces are also things that USU researchers will need to comport with. We already pretty much require each of the requirements of USU Policy 534 in terms of our review processes, so it's really not much that's new, but just want to make folks aware that the IRB approval carve out that currently exists in 534 is being eliminated in USU policy. There's an April 17th Utah Student Data Privacy Training. It lasts a half day from 9:30 to 12:30. I will also be attending, but I have a link to some information about that in the event you are interested in using student data in your research. It could be a really nice thing for folks to attend. We talked about the activities that require specific parental consent, and this is just a link to that specific Utah law so that you can review for yourself its requirements and make sure that you're structuring your research study to comport with those requirements. I have a link here to our templates for informed consent and assent. They all live in a box folder. It includes a FERPA authorization template. So we talked earlier about that potential two-step process where you just first ask for information that's included in records and then move to providing more targeted information to eligible families about your study. And so we have a separate document that you can use just for that purpose. But again, very important that you're working with your school partners to make sure that you're meeting their requirements for releasing information under FERPA as well. We have a guidance document on working with your own students that I referenced that has some of those recommendations I just talked about, but it lives permanently on our website so that you can access it anytime. And then finally, if you want some requests for just our help, we have a consultation request form on our website. You just give us your top 3 times that you want to meet, and we will make sure to pair you up with somebody who can. And then we sort of treat our Ask the IRB Slack as a live chat during working hours. So if you message us between 8 and 5, Monday through Friday, that is not a holiday. We're usually around unless we're in staff meeting, and we are available to answer any questions you might have about your research project in that capacity. We ask that you use DMs if it's like super specific to your research, because people get notified of messages on the main channel, and if it's really specific to you, you can just ask us without generating notifications to the rest of the research community. Otherwise, if you have general questions like, hey, does directory information under FERPA include free or reduced lunch status? You can ask those sorts of questions in the main page, which might be something somebody else is also wondering. With that, we have some time for Q&A.
So right now, we just have one question that we haven't dealt with. And that is, if students did not provide their GPA or other demographic factors in my study, can we follow up with the school to receive this information without violating FERPA?
That's a great question. If you have specific parental consent to access that information, then yes. Or you might be talking about a higher education context since you're saying students did not provide. In the higher education context, the student themselves holds the ability to protect those records. And so yes, if they gave their specific consent for you to access those records, you can request that information. Otherwise, generally speaking, GPA and demographic factors are protected by FERPA when they tie to a specific student, and you do need specific consent in order to access that information.
Right now, there are no other. Oh, if a doc student wants to begin researching in a school in the autumn, what would you, I guess in the fall, what would you suggest submitting? When would you suggest submitting the IRB proposal?
It's a great question. So let's assume it's at the expedited review level, which is often the case when you, for example, want to survey a student. And so if you want to do like a social validity component to your project, you should plan for 26 days. That was the median review time last calendar year for all expedited protocols. And it is the longer end because we actually do spend a lot of time waiting for district approval. And so if you take out the protocols that are just waiting on district approval, we generally have those done in about 19 or 20 days, but it takes the district a little while longer to get that final approval to us so that we can get you the final approval to carry out your study. So if you want to start in the autumn, so let's say mid-August, no later than mid-July. But again, make sure that you've worked on your district partnering school districts timeline. Some school districts that have more robust review procedures only meet once a month to review these types of requests. And so a mid-July submission to the IRB may, depending on what their review time frame looks like, or whether you need translations and translations reviewed and all of that. So certainly plan for mid-July, but make sure that you're attending to those other factors, which may take additional time.
One more just came in. Are we able to survey K through 12 students, or did the state legislature limit that type of research?
Oh yeah, you, to the best of my knowledge, there is no limit on surveying K to 12 students except those topics which I visited about earlier. I'll bring that slide up real quick just for your reference. Here we are. So if you're asking about any of these items, you need to get specific parental consent before a child can sit for your survey in a K to 12 context. This does not prohibit you from recruiting students into a study that takes place outside of the K to 12 context to ask about any of these items.
All right, there's one more. Since we're running out of time, I'm going to go ahead and ask this final one. And then if you have other questions, you're welcome to contact us via the channels that Nicole already talked about. Last one. If I'm working with an after-school program that's affiliated with the school district, do I need approval from the district if the group of participants I'm interested in is involved in the after-school program?
In 99% of cases, yes, because those after-school programs are affiliated with the school district. You are using school district property or school district time, and you must obtain district approval in such cases.
Okay, that's the end of the questions.
All right. Well then, thanks everyone. And as Ron mentioned, we would love to get your feedback on trainings for the 2024-25 academic year. So if you scan that, it's a general feedback form, but the only thing that you need to provide are comments. And so you can just say, hey, I'm interested in this training topic for the next year. And when Ron and I meet to set those for the next semester, we will review any of the requests we received through that portal.
Okay.
All right.
Nicole, thank you. And thanks all of you that signed up. We will be sending you the slides, and the slides will be available on the IRB website. So that concludes the training for today. Thanks a lot.